Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Despite riding high in the polls and facing a weak Prime Minister, Australia's centre-right coalition suffered a stunning defeat. So, what's happening to populists in Australia and elsewhere? We're joined by the roving Australian reporter Latika Bourke, back from the UK, or back from Australia and back in the UK, and also she's seen a new pope as well. I don't know how you managed to pack it all in. How is it going, Latika?
Well, staying alive, staying awake, lots of coffee. But yeah, it was a fascinating election in Australia. And I spent every single day on the campaign, which is a pretty superhuman effort. I think there's only one other journalist that might have done that. So other than the leaders and the staff, there's not that many reporters who spend all day, every day on the campaign trail the way I did. But it was a very fascinating insight that I had as a result of that into why the election went the way it did and also how the leaders themselves shaped that outcome.
Yeah. I mean, at the start, it seemed to me that the Liberals were expected to do much better, and Albanese was not doing well in the polls. So, what happened during the campaign? How did that change?
So the Liberals, not to be confused with Canada's Liberals, the Liberals in Australia are the centre-right party. And that's also an interesting word because the Liberals over time have become a far more conservative party. And this is part of the explanation and story as to what's gone on here. In the old days, the Liberals was a much more, I guess, a little bit more Lib Demi, but certainly it was more a progressive party that took in city voters. It would have stood and did stand, for instance, for things like same-sex marriage, very market-oriented and very free trading oriented. It was certainly a government that wanted to stay out of bedrooms and things like that. Now, over, I would say, the course of the last 15 years, and really climate change has accelerated this, that party has turned more and more into a proper conservative party and at times bordering on populism. So we'll come back to that. Now, why did it all go wrong? Well, it certainly wasn't the case that it had to go wrong. For about 2 years, the Conservatives or the Liberal Party were polling pretty evenly and at times in front of the Labor Party. Now, that concealed the scale of what was actually required for them to return to power in one term, which has never been done in Australia since 1929, I think it is. So basically going back to the Depression. And that was a swing of like 20 seats or so. That's huge. It's really, really huge. And I have never been convinced that that was going to be something that the opposition was capable of doing. I thought best case scenario, they might come out with a minority government where they could be in a position to form minority government. So when I arrived in Australia at the end of March, my take very much was this election is certainly open. It's up for grabs. We have a Prime Minister in Anthony Albanese who sets nobody's world on fire. He's a really lackluster Prime Minister. He doesn't have big scale ambition. He doesn't like actually talking about things like revolutionary policies. He's just an incrementalist who is very, very good at tactics, but not so good at setting out a grand vision. And that really has turned people off him. Also, of course, we had all the usual things that have been dragging down incumbent governments over the last couple of years: inflation, the COVID hangover, all those sorts of things. What then transpired was a really different scenario to one that anyone expected. Firstly, the Prime Minister himself really improved. The last two campaigns he'd fought, including the election and a referendum about 18 months later into his term on whether or not to have an Indigenous voice enshrined in the Constitution, very controversial in Australia, and that was defeated, and he ran a very bad campaign then. So everybody was expecting that he would replicate his poor campaigning skills in 2025. That did not happen. I spent 4 weeks on his plane, spent a lot of time with him, probably too much time with him, and he was a changed man. He was so sharp, he was focused, he was across his brief. So basic, number one, competence really changed the game. On the other side, Peter Dutton turned up on election day. There's this famous saying in Australia and in UK politics. It's often attributed to Linton Crosby, but it's actually not Linton Crosby's phrase, that you can't fatten a pig on market day. Well, Peter Dutton was not so much a leader who tried to fatten the pig on market day. He took the pig to slaughter day and had fed it so little it was bone. at first cut. That's how poorly prepared he was. And this was really astonishing because this was a complete unforced error. It was one he didn't have to make, and it was his decision alone to not produce any policies. Everyone thought that he was holding on to all these blockbuster policies at the final minute because he was going to go, wow, here's some fireworks. We're going to blow Labor, this really crappy government, out of the water. And it just didn't happen.
But just give us a quick flavour of, so what was he saying? What was, I mean, if very quickly, what does Albanese stand for, and what do the Liberals stand for, and what was the specific message during the campaign?
Not a lot. It was an election that was fought on not a lot, but where the differences were completely toxic for the Liberals and a complete vote winner for Labor. And so what Labor did was they worked out that cost of living and global anxieties were two pervasive forces that were turning people off Labor. Very cleverly, they leaned heavily into Medicare, which is like the NHS, so it's universal healthcare. And they said, we're going to increase the number of free doctor's appointments you can get and the clinics where you can get free healthcare services in an emergency situation, which is ideally meant to relieve A&E or emergency departments. Then they said, this is a cost of living measure. And then they said, and this is why we're not like Donald Trump, wink, wink. This is why we don't want the Americanization of our health system, wink, wink. And by the way, that guy over there is going to rip out all this funding on free healthcare because that's what he's like. He's a bit like that other guy, wink, wink. On the other side, you had Peter Dutton, who had announced a very bare policy showing. But what he did announce was disastrous. It was a work from home ban for public servants in Canberra that was announced shortly after Donald Trump's return to in-person work memorandum on Inauguration Day. He announced he was going to cut around 2/3 of the public service in Canberra. This is just so ridiculous. It's not funny. There's no way that you could do this. And of course, it just looks like an attack that's woke, anti-woke, and a leaf out of Donald Trump's playbook. And then he very belatedly announced he would raise defence spending and things like this. His solution to housing was to give first home buyers a tax deductibility on their mortgage repayments, so you would be able to claim your mortgage repayments as a tax deduction. I mean, this stuff was just junk economics. And of course, it all went down like a lead balloon. But the most difficult thing was that where he had lent so close, and this was the other thing, he announced his own Doge, which he late in the campaign interview with me ran a million miles away from saying, oh, this is a copy of Trump. It was like, no, we've always done this. But all these things together just looked like he was copying Trump. And so it was an absolute blinder for the Labor Party to just merge his identity with Donald Trump. And they spent about 3 weeks viciously doing this, just saying this guy will Americanize our society, this guy will Americanize our healthcare, and it worked. And Peter Dutton just had nowhere to go. He didn't try to fight back, and it just completely swamped him. And I've had Liberal MPs tell me on the doors the work from home thing was completely devastating, and that led people to say, not only do you not understand us and how we're living our lives as modern families, which is a big problem, but also I think you're a bit like that guy. And my belief is that at the start of the year when Donald Trump was inaugurated, or even in November, there was a slight window where Australians were looking and saying, is this guy actually got something that's worth looking at? Is there a chance that all this radicalism leads to some good policy outcomes? But then I think the Zelensky moment happened. In week 2 of the campaign, Donald Trump imposes his tariffs, Liberation Day happens. The stock market crashes, pensioners look up and see in Australia we have compulsory superannuation. So they look up and see their pension balances being wiped, and there was no road back from this.
That's absolutely fascinating. So you've got obviously this is sort of self-evident, an Australian context to this. The campaign is being fought really on Australian issues, but Trump is like an accelerant. He pours fuel on the fire. A bad message becomes even worse by association with him.
Yeah, I remember at the end of the second week, I spent the first 3 weeks with Anthony Albanese, and then I think week 4 I went to the opposition leader. So at the end of the second week, I turned around to another journalist and I just said, I cannot believe how much of this election campaign, how much of my every day as a press journalist here at these press conferences, and he would sometimes do 1 or 2 or even 3 a day, we are just asking him to respond to what's happened in the White House. I mean, this is extraordinary. Even by Donald Trump standards, it was still extraordinary that a domestic election was being fought and shaped and discussed in the context of one guy in the White House. That has never happened. The only intrusion that a foreign power usually has in Australian domestic debates around an election is China. This election, it was the United States. In fact, China barely got a word. And that to me is really significant. And that goes some way to explaining why it was so diabolical for the Liberals. Because if the conversation had been on China, it probably would have played into the Liberals' strengths, which is usually the economy and national security. But they have over time squandered their equities on both of that. And that is a huge task for them ahead to reclaim those credentials for themselves.
In a bit, I want to talk about Trump's effect on other populists around the world. So both in Europe, we can think of Giorgia Meloni, who's struggling with that role. We can think of Mark Carney in Canada. We'll come back to those in a second, but I want to stay with Australia for a moment. Surely now Albanese, he's got a very strong mandate. Tell us a bit about his mandate at home, and then we'll come on to foreign policy and where that leaves Australia with both the US and China. But first of all, domestic policy. What happens? Continuity? Has things been revved up? What's expected of him now?
So election night was so funny. So I was at my mothership, Channel 7 in Sydney headquarters, and sitting up in what we call the Situation Room with a bunch of government staffers, a bunch of opposition people, all being on the rotational list to go on air, talk about the results as they're unfolding. Now, when I was young, elections were usually decided in a couple of hours, or you knew the results in a couple of hours, and you would go to bed. The speeches would be on 9 or 10 p.m. and you'd go to bed and you'd know what government you were waking up to the next morning. Since 2010, when we had a minority government, elections have become so close in Australia that it can be, well, in that case, it was 3 weeks before we knew the outcome of an election. And sometimes we've had a couple of days. Other times we don't know the results of seats for weeks. This election was called in about 2 hours by my network. And there were some government staffers who were younger than me, and they're sitting there. And at the end of the night, you know, we're all done and dusted. And they kind of looked up and I'm like, wait, what? Is that it? And I'm like, yes, guys, this is what it used to be like. This is how stable Australian politics used to be.
And Dutton loses his seat, which he's held for 24 years.
Yeah. And so I tell this story because there's a lot happening in this particular result that says a lot about our past and a lot about our future and what's different. One, we haven't had in Australia, because it's been so unstable and turbulent, a prime minister re-elected in their own right for a second term since 2004. Anthony Albanese wins. That's the first time that's happened. Second thing is he's the first person since 1966 to increase his margin as an incumbent. He starts out with a 3-seat majority, 78 seats. He is going to have 94 seats. This landslide is enormous. It's absolutely enormous. I thought it would be a landslide. I said this to the PM myself after our interview. We're flying on his VIP. We call it the BBJ in Australia. And I said, look, PM, I think this is all over. It's a landslide for you. And, you know, he did the usual, not getting ahead of myself. But I think secretly deep down he thought it would be a very strong win too. Nobody, not even the Labor Party's strategists, who I spoke to on the night of the election at their party, thought it would be 94. I thought it would be around 84. So 94 is extraordinary. I cannot illustrate how extraordinary that is in Australian politics. More so because his primary vote was only 34%. So you have the similar thing that we're seeing here in the UK, which is people don't like major two parties. There's still a very strong independent third party, anyone but the major two vote that's happening. But because in Australia we have compulsory voting and preferential voting, those preferences have to go somewhere. And on this instance, the Liberals are calling it a collusion of the left. But essentially all those preferences come back to Labor. So That result is huge. Peter Dutton is the first opposition leader to lose his seat. Literally, the night of the election, I put on my Twitter, has this ever happened before in Australia? An opposition leader losing their seat. We've only had Prime Minister lose their seat twice, Stanley Bruce and John Howard, and this is the first time that's happened. So the landslide and the sweep, particularly across Queensland, which is a more traditionally conservative state, was extraordinary. Where does that leave Anthony Albanese? Well, this, I think, is the big question of his second term. His first term has been marked by him being a pretty crappy prime minister. He lost a voice referendum. This was very divisive. He should never have put it up in the way he did. And when he realised it was not going to get up, he should have taken it off the table. I mean, it was an unforgivable thing what he did. And that has trashed Indigenous. I think in Australia there's a lot of sympathy and people want to get what we call closing the gap between health and life expectations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians are actually growing by some metrics. And this is a disgrace for us as a country. We should be fixing it and we're not. So there is a huge desire in Australia to see that gap closed. But unfortunately, a lot of money is put towards these programs. It doesn't lead necessarily to better metrics or outcomes. We have huge crime problems in remote Indigenous communities. Look, these are not issues that are solved overnight, and we certainly haven't even shown ourselves capable of solving them over decades. So that referendum has trashed a conversation on what needs to happen about helping close that gap, and that's a big stain on Anthony Albanese. He also has not been a brilliant communicator until the time of the election, and he's also got not a lot of big vision. Now, he thinks this is a strength. He was asked on the final day, are you a reformer prime minister? Because people were thinking, what are you going to do if you get your second term? And he says, look, I'm a reformer, not a revolutionary. That, I think, was very, very insightful. He's a very incrementalist prime minister. He's very timid and cautious and unsure on foreign policy. Where he is surest is machine politics, and he loves things like labour welfare programs. So Medicare is a big one that he will want to lean into. He's not that strong on the economy, and he has ploughed huge spending. Gross debt in Australia is about to go up to 1.2 trillion. So we have a very uncertain environment ahead of us. And in that context, what's he spending on? He's spending on more free doctors' appointments as opposed to defence spending, for example, which should be going up higher than it is. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on him. I don't think it will come from the opposition because they're a really hollowed out force now. They're, just about decimated. And what I think will take shape in the next term is a fierce debate on economics, because there will be a realisation, particularly for the next generation of Labor MPs who will be the custodians of the economy. And Albanese will depart the stage at some point, and it's them that will be left with the economic shape of the country. There will be a debate, I think, about how much spending we have. That will be difficult and that will be tough. And I think that's one of the only ways the Liberals can try and resurrect themselves. And then I do think we have a national security debate, and neither of these topics are good for the Prime Minister. And so this is a huge unknown about the second term in Australia. Whether Australia continues down the path it's going, which is becoming a bit more like Western Europe, high social net, which the public like, but we do have that very reliant on income tax in Australia and iron ore. And if our iron ore should suddenly stop, or something happen with China in a Taiwan contingency, we are so vulnerable in that scenario. Secondly, on national security, if something should happen in the Taiwan Strait or around the Indo-Pacific or South China Sea or the Philippines, and it's a Trump administration requiring Australia to go help or contribute, that's also going to be a very difficult conversation. So they're the two big picture things I think really troubling the Labor Party in this term ahead. Yeah. I think for now it's very much he will take a joyride around the world for the next 6 months. He was very quick to go to the Pope's inaugural mass, for instance. That's not something he would have done in the first term with a 3-seat majority. But he says he's got 3 faiths, his local football team, the Labor Party and the Catholic Church. So he was very, very excited to go to the inaugural mass, and I shadowed him there, and it was actually genuinely, I think, pretty emotional for him.
So, I mean, you mentioned defence, and I think it's important to highlight the vulnerabilities there with the huge amount of spending, the spendathon, as it's called, on welfare, increasing budget expenditure on domestic issues. But you were at Parliament recently here in the UK, and it was essentially the celebration of the AUKUS Pact. This is the pact between the US, Australia, committing to a new submarine program. So it that seems to go against this sense of uncertainty that the US is not a reliable partner. And it would seem to me that both the UK and Australia are betting that the US can be reliable on this particular issue. And I'm slightly confounded by that. And so I'm interested in your take on it and what you think the Australian government's take on it is.
Yes, I think AUKUS, so let's just recap what AUKUS is. It's a program Australia initiated with the UK and the United States to acquire their nuclear propulsion technology for submarines. That is a program that will see Australia buy 2, maybe more, off-the-shelf Virginia-class submarines from the United States. After that, the UK and Australia are going to try and co-build a submarine together, and that will be a new class of a submarine called SSN-AUKUS. Now, that's after Virginia's come. There's a lot that needs to go right for all those things to happen. It's Australia's most expensive defence acquisition. It is pretty well supported, so there's definite bipartisan support for that. I would not say the Labor Party's heart is genuinely in AUKUS. I don't think if it was them that had to choose nuclear subs versus conventional, they would have gone down this route. This was a decision of the former coalition government, but they have said we absolutely support it. Now, this comes in the context of a couple of things. Our own capability in submarines is fading quickly. We have the window of opportunity that all the analysts expect Xi Jinping to move on Taiwan narrowing and closing. And I don't think what Donald Trump is doing in Ukraine is giving us any more wiggle room there. I think it's probably giving us less. So we also have very low defence spending. It's around 2.2% of GDP. That is an increase under Labor, but it is also by no means fast enough. And it is also by no means high enough. And so you have Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, meeting our Defence Minister, Richard Marles, at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore and overnight, actually. And what has happened there is the United States have started to say, okay, let's have a conversation about raising your defence spending. So the same conversation that Europe and NATO that we're so familiar with here, that is now starting to affect us. I think this is an absolute abomination from Labor. They should not be waiting for the United States to tell us to look after our own security better. This is something that we should be doing because we need to do it, and we actually do need to do it. Just before the election, there was a circumnavigation of Australia by a Chinese naval flotilla. And this is where the Labor Party is very vulnerable because the Chinese didn't alert the Australian government. The Australian government is very proud that they've stabilised the relationship with China, but yet China didn't pick up the phone and say, hey, we're coming into your neighbourhood. And by the way, there's a bit of international water between New Zealand and Australia. We're going to sit there for a while and do some live firing exercises. The way we found out about that was a Virgin Airlines pilot flying overhead at the time, being warned of it, and then they relayed that message back to Australia. I mean, if Peter Dutton had even done a scintilla of homework, things like that could have been an explosive election issue. It also showed our underpreparedness. It exposed that we don't really have a lot of kit to go and look after this kind of thing, should it happen. And that flotilla circumnavigated Australia with ease. And the government actually made excuses for them. So let's go back to your question about AUKUS. There is certainly a fear, and has been a fear in Australia, that the Trump administration is not necessarily on board with AUKUS. We have never heard, still, Donald Trump say, I support AUKUS. If it were up to me to sign off those boats, which it won't be him unless he has a third or fourth term, if it were up to me, I would sign off the sale of a Virginia-class submarine to Australia, knowing that there are strains and stresses on the US industrial output. And that's really the problem. It's not a political will issue here. It's that the US is struggling to keep up with production of its submarines at its own rate. What we have had are some very positive comments from Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, and very surprisingly for me, last Monday when I got back from Rome from the Vatican to cover that inaugural Mass, I went straight to the Commons. There was a House of Lords reception put on by the all-party parliamentary group for AUKUS. It was massive. I've never seen an APPG this oversubscribed. That room fits 150 people, 400 people RSVP'd, and MPs who are members of this APPG were turned away. There you had the US ambassador, so Trump's political appointment, and remember these guys are political, they speak for the administration, Warren Stevens. He gives his first remarks in the UK, and where is it? It's at an AUKUS event. What does he say? He says this is supported bipartisan in the United States. He couldn't stop saying that word bipartisan. Hang about. We're seeing a MAGA person, we're seeing a Trump person praising bipartisanship. This is pretty extraordinary in my book. Then in comes Keir Starmer, and he gives a speech saying, I'm personally dedicated, committed to AUKUS. This is something I personally care about. I've never heard the UK Prime Minister talk about AUKUS that way either. Two very, very promising signs. Now, interestingly, a very senior security official I spoke to at that event in the UK side said to me they would still really like to hear President Trump himself say that he supports AUKUS, because there is a strain of thinking within the MAGA crowd in the Pentagon. Some of those people have been moved into the Pentagon. Some of them are in the administration. Some of them are just outside in the think tank land, that they can't afford to give that capability to Australia. And they would like Trump to send that signal to his own people that, yes, it's okay from Trump. So there is still these lingering kind of doubts, but really it will all come down to whether the United States has the ability to speed up its own submarine production, and that would free it to sell us 2 or more boats. And no one can be sure of that answer right now.
Yeah, okay. So such an interesting issue. I do want more questions, please. So if you can put questions directly to Latika, just type them in the Q&A box, or just simply put hit the hand button, raise your hand, and you can put your questions directly to Latika. Coming back to this idea of the Trump effect, what impact Trump is having on domestic politics, it seems clear that it's counterproductive. I mean, if we can look at Mark Carney in Canada, Giorgia Meloni is having a pretty tough time of balancing, trying to say, look, I'm a great friend of Trump, we can settle things for Europe. In actual fact, it's not really working that much. So if you're trying to make Italy great again, or Australia great again, it doesn't seem to be working in your favor. And then I want to come on to another thought, which is I think people are learning how to stand up to Trump. We've seen what happened with Zelensky. We've seen what happened with Ramaphosa. I think now we've moved into a different fear. We didn't know where we were. We didn't know how to handle him. And I think you know a bit better, and there's no necessity to kowtow to him.
Yeah, this is something I'm exploring, both these angles, actually. I am stunned that the Trump effect, it has absolutely strangled Pierre Poilievre in Canada. It in Australia absolutely strangled Peter Dutton. I had a very interesting conversation with a senior Conservative here in the UK last week, and we were talking about this. And they said to me, do you think maybe Trump's doing this deliberately? And I think the answer is yes. Well, we both agreed yes. I think there is certainly a thought within conservative movements around the world now that Trump wants to be the biggest conservative of all. And of course, he's not really a conservative, he's populist, and that he wants to redefine conservatism in the image of MAGA. And I think if you put that into context of what J.D. Vance, the vice president, did when he went to Munich, he met the AfD. He also stood up and berated Europe. And we will see this in a coming debate as well in the UK about their lack of what they perceive to be free speech. So I do think there is a genuine desire within MAGA to constrict free-thinking liberals, because that is actually a threat to the ideology of Make America Great Again, if that is, this right-wing populism, maybe some would say illiberalism, potentially bordering on fascism, if not the real thing. Let's see. Maybe there is this strain. I think that's fascinating in the UK context as to why that's killing the Conservatives and not Nigel Farage, because Nigel Farage is the one guy who stands up and says, I want a Doge. He says, I'm mates with Trump. I hang out in his gaudy gold elevator with him. Here we are. I mean, it's astonishing. The two Conservatives in Pierre Poilievre and Peter Dutton, who are trying to keep their distance around a mile from Donald Trump and say so very much on the record, they're the ones that get killed politically. And polling-wise, Nigel Farage is just zooming up the polls here. So much so that Labor's even saying that they are the choice. It's the choice between Labor and Reform. So I think this is...
Why is it? Yeah, why? I mean, to me, the Labour government is acting like a Conservative government and trying to compete with Farage. And it seems to be, in actual fact, your votes are, if you think of red wall votes, you need to be focusing on public spending. You need to be making sure you're not cutting welfare. We've seen a reversal on fuel payments. So it seems all wrong to me. It seems very muddled here.
Yeah, look, I think that's part of the zeitgeist, isn't it? The major parties are not institutions that people relate to and habitually vote for anymore. And so they're all over the shop, but so are voters. And I think that's quite exciting if you are an adaptive politician, because voters are saying, I'll look at any of you. I mean, there's room for new movements here. There's room for a much fresher thinking about what a modern Labor Party, a modern Conservative Party in Australia. I think the Liberals could really bounce back and have a completely re-energised new mission and focus if they do this right. And they could be an extraordinary party, or they could squander it and a new movement could come through, or they cede the ground to the right-wing populists. That's also absolutely up for grabs. I think in the UK, and I also put Peter Dutton very strongly into this camp, political insecurity will kill you. If you do not know who you are, what you stand for, what your instincts tell you are red lines and boundaries automatically, you shouldn't even have to think of some of these things. And there's a great question.
It's less about actual policies than
and there's a great question which I'll come to, because this goes to what Rob H is asking.
I think we need to.
Should we go to that now?
Yeah, if we can put those questions directly to you. So I don't know. So it was that was Rob. I don't know if we get. Yeah, Rob, can you go ahead and open your microphone and put your question directly? Go ahead, Rob. Do you just need to open your microphone, which is probably on the bottom left side of your screen. So you open your mic. If you look at the bottom of your screen on the bottom left-hand side, you should be able to see your microphone. And if not, Latika, so the question is to Albanese was criticised for a lot for his term for being slow on support of Ukraine, delaying military aid and reopening an embassy to much criticism. But then he ended up supporting the coalition of the willing and the Dutton opposition, didn't he? How did that come about? Bill, are you there? Yeah, you're there now, aren't you? No, I can't hear you. So sorry, Latika.
Should I go ahead? Okay. Well, Rob, this is a very perceptive and preemptive question, and I would encourage you to listen to my podcast that will be coming out on Sunday, because we discussed this with Andrew Hastie, who was the Shadow Defence Minister, about what happened here. This goes exactly to what I was saying about political insecurity. I personally think that the day Peter Dutton lost the election was when he turned his back on Ukraine, because this was an absolute non-negotiable, and yet he somehow broke and severed what people should never have to question about him, which is where you stand on something like safeguarding an international order that protects Australia, a smaller country, and our neighbours and allies.
But that doesn't affect Farage, does it? Because he's kowtowed and said that he was going back, admired Putin, and I mean, I spoke personally to Farage back in January last year, and exactly the same message. No, we've got to get out of Ukraine.
Yeah, I'm exploring this very carefully for a piece I'm writing next week. There's a couple of things going on with the Russia. One is that, of course, everyone is now scrambling for peace. So it's enabling Farage to say, well, I've been here all the time. You're all coming to my school of thought. A bit like what's happening with Israel and Gaza now. A lot of the critics of Israel are saying, well, nice to see you. You know, where have you been? I've been here in this school of thought for a long, long time. And by the way, what I said was going to happen is coming true. So there's a bit of that Farage is benefiting on Russia. Another thing I think is that the people that really strongly back that MAGA isolationism, anti-Ukrainism, maybe pro-Putinism, I think they're already with Farage, so it doesn't affect him there. And then because there's so much uncertainty around where Ukraine is going, it's pretty difficult at the moment to land a blow on Farage for being anti-Ukraine or pro-Russia, because the whole conversation is about what the future relationship between Russia and the West looks like. So I think until Ukraine, we know one way or the other what the Trump administration is going to do or not, it's very difficult for that to hurt Farage. It did hurt him, I think, before the election. You might remember there was that story where he went a bit too far, and the Daily Mail actually went the strongest on him. So it has been an issue for him. I think the more, though, that we progress towards peace, ceasefire, negotiations, talks, whatever is happening, the more that is muddied and war is...
I think you're wrong on that. I think that's for the birds. I think we'll still be fighting Russia in a year's time. But Bill, if you want any follow up on that one, Bill, if you just, because I know your question was very much related to that, Bill H.
Well, I think the teachers answered really my questions. I just do find it amazing how strong Farage just can come from nowhere, really, and be they were part of having to respond to him. Anyway, that's it.
Yeah, I will write this piece, and maybe you can send it to your subscribers next week, Nicholas, when I publish this. I spoke to Ian Duncan Smith, the former Conservative Party leader, about this exact point. And I said, why is the Trump effect not killing him? When are you going to start badging him? And he said, well, one, it's not an election yet. Obviously, we had the locals, but it's not a national election yet. Keep in mind, there's still 4 years. Anything can happen. Keir could get better. Keir could do so badly they change leaders to a better leader. We don't know. We don't know how Trump will end up. I presume and predict that Trump will end up even more unpopular in Britain in a couple of years' time. And if it's JD Vance, I think he'll be a very, very disliked figure in the United Kingdom by the time of the next election. So the election is far away, and we shouldn't really lose sight of that. There's plenty of time for Farage to implode, have fights with his own side. But one thing I would say is that he is professionalising reform, and he is not to be underestimated. I think he is an incredibly durable figure. And you look at someone like Trump, actually what modern politics is showing is that age is a benefit now. Older politicians are getting elected leaders. People who have been on the scene for 20, 30 years are becoming the sexiest thing at the ballot box. So I think there is a real danger that Nigel Farage does actually become the de facto opposition, and then it's up to Labor to kind of kill him. I think one of the only ways they can try and kill him politically is to do well and get the economy going, because once the economy actually goes and they get migration down in real numbers, well, people start to not blame migrants for everything, because suddenly they can afford to live a bit more. Things are working, services are working. They don't feel like migrants are taking up on the strain of things. Nigel Farage is also a snake oil salesman. He is selling a recipe that cannot be put together and baked into a perfect cake. He is on one hand saying, I'm going to increase all these benefits or remove benefit caps or limits, and on the other hand saying, I want to cut taxes. He cannot spend and save at the same time. At some point in time, the hollowness of his economic offer will hurt him. So if you're worried about reform, my personal advice would be chill for now, because there's a long way to go and there's a lot of things that can take place. And there certainly are potent ways to attack reform that neither side have really gotten into gear now. And I did think it was interesting that yesterday Keir Starmer came out and his association game was not Nigel is Donald Trump. His association was Nigel is Liz Truss. That I thought was really, really fascinating. And I think that's potentially devastating, because everyone knows Liz Truss crash the economy. If they can put in voters' minds, Farage will crash the economy. Yeah, I do think that's a pretty potent weapon. But I do, Nicholas, I want to answer Rob H's question because we didn't actually answer that. And it is really critical. Albanese, yes, and I was been one of the biggest critics of this in Australia, to the point where the Prime Minister and I had a bit of a barney when I first saw him, and he said, "You've got to stop writing these critical articles about me." And I said, "Well, you need to do better on Ukraine and Europe, Prime Minister." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, haven't you seen what I'm doing with Keir Starmer?" And this I thought was very insightful, because Keir Starmer, and we should all want and hope that Keir Starmer does very well. It is so critical not to the UK, not just for the UK. It is critical to Western and European leadership at this point in time. So I really hope Keir Starmer does not screw this up. Albanese told me that the two leaders in Europe that he feels the closest to are Macron and Keir Starmer. And guess what? When those two leaders said, "I want to form a coalition of the willing," guess where Australia's Labor Prime Minister, who has almost no interest in Ukraine, almost no interest in foreign policy, really doesn't want to talk about national security, and is pretty timid on defence. Guess where he was? On the virtual call with Macron and Starmer, his buddies, saying, how can Australia contribute and help? Astonishingly, back to my earlier point about political insecurity, Peter Dutton was like, we're not going to be in the part of the coalition of the willing. He gave phenomenal reasons. First, we don't have resources. There is a bit of truth to that, but Australia has a proud tradition of sending very highly skilled elite squads to serve in missions with our allies. We learn a lot from it. And it's also incredibly important to who we are as a country. There is no way Peter Dutton, as a coalition leader and a former defence minister, should have opposed this. And then other reasons he gave, which I think were the most troubling, and I think this also just subliminally killed him and associated him with Trump. He said, well, we don't want to put our troops in danger's way with a lunatic on the other side of the border with nuclear weapons. I mean, that is the MAGA excuse for not arming Ukraine properly. That is the MAGA excuse for a fig leaf for sympathising with Putin. I don't think Peter Dutton does sympathise with Putin. I just want to make that clear. But that line of reasoning, what the hell? And then the third line he gave was that he said, well, we wouldn't have a security blanket of the US in Ukraine because they're not going to be part of the coalition of the willing. We don't operate overseas without the US being there. Well, that's just a lie. And I put that to him on the campaign trail. We've operated in Cyprus. We've operated in Israel. We operate in Mozambique. There's an absolute truckload of countries that Australia has contributed to peacekeeping missions that have not involved the United States. So for all the reasons he gave, he was completely wrong. And I do think that contributed to his routing at the ballot box. So it's an important lesson to stay true to what you actually are and should be. And if you don't know what you are, don't be in politics.
Yeah.
And Rob, I hope that answered your question.
Neil, who's are you in Sydney? Neil, I can't remember. And if you can open your microphone too, your hand's up. You just need to open your microphone. If you don't open your microphone, you won't be. There you go, Neil. Go ahead.
There we go. Thanks, Nicholas. I'm from Canberra in Australia. Technical problems saw me miss a little bit, Latika. So I don't know whether you dealt with the nuclear question. Peter Dutton was keen to introduce nuclear policy in Australia, and then during the election wouldn't go near it. How much of an effect do you think this had on the campaign?
Neil, that is a great question, and we haven't discussed this, and it's one definitely worth discussing. So thank you. Terrific question. Well, I would also implore you to listen to my podcast on Sunday because we discuss this in length as well with Andrew Hastie. Nuclear is a really interesting issue politically for Australia. It's a no-go zone, as Neil knows. There's a moratorium on it imposed by government. So it's not just like Australians don't support nuclear. We actually have a ban on the development of nuclear power. What changes the game is AUKUS. Once we have nuclear technology in our submarines, outside of a submarine, why are we still having a ban on technology we've accepted, incorporated, will work on and help build in a defence sense, but not for our energy sense? We have huge supplies of uranium in Australia. So interestingly, when Peter Dutton first lobbed the idea of nuclear, Labor went, I think, a bit troppo and started releasing memes of three-eyed fish and kind of the Simpsons nuclear attack kind of stuff, the radiation risk. That was a disaster, and people really reacted badly to that, and they stopped it. But by the time of the election, what they did was really clever. What they said was the cost of nuclear is so high because in Australia we'd be starting from scratch. So yes, it would be phenomenally high. Peter Dutton can only afford to pay for nuclear if he's cutting Medicare, all those things we were talking about at the start, all those cost of living Labor welfare programs. So he'll cut all these services to pay for this energy we don't really need because, by the way, renewables are going just fine. Now, Australian energy costs are extraordinarily high. So there is a debate to have about that. And there's certainly a debate to have about what technology gets you to decarbonisation in the most stable and efficient and cheap way. But Peter Dutton himself was incapable of fighting, I think, anything, really. I have no idea why this guy went into politics. He just didn't even show up, It was like the Crocodile Dundee scene. You call that a knife? This is a knife. I mean, this guy didn't even turn up with a pocket knife. He completely vacated the field. They had a really bold, ambitious, courageous decision to back nuclear or at least raise the moratorium. They went too far in saying where these nuclear plants would be. They wanted them on old coal stations. And then they also went too far in saying that the government would subsidise them. All they had to do was say we would lift the ban and let the market go in the event that it becomes viable for Australia, which I probably think there is still a case to be made for that. So it's a big debate now about whether the Liberals stick with this policy. I think they should, personally, but I think that's as far as they should go. Labor is absolutely adamant that nuclear is a ballot box killer. They prosecuted this with absolute vehemence on the campaign trail. I mean, to some point, stupidity. There was a day in Queensland where we're on the trail and one of the ministers said to me off camera, he's like, you've got to stop rolling your eyes at the Prime Minister, Latika. There's a lot of facial expressions. And I said, oh, well, I just can't stand these stupid responses you're giving on, today it was Peter Dutton is going to build a nuclear plant in Brisbane and in his own electorate. I mean, this is just stupid, moronic stuff. The scare campaign they managed to run on it was extraordinary. The coalition did nothing to counter it, but Labor were pretty stupid on it too. So that's a really, I think this debate is another one for this next term. I think the Liberals will probably land on keeping it, but going no further than saying we just lift the moratorium, which I think would be very, very sensible for them to do.
I want to come back to this idea of the Trump effect on populism. And so far, we've said it's been counterproductive. And, there are lots of nuances in different areas. We came back from Moldova a couple of weeks back, and that's really the front line with Russia in some ways. And what I'm reminded by is that the conflict with Russia, which is really the existential crisis of our times, we don't have the United States behind us, Europe's got to come together. And the real question I learned from being there is, will Europe come together? And it's by no means certain that you have countries that are led by governments that are willing to take Russia on. Moldova, Russian influence operations are there in ample forms. Next door in Romania, Simon, who was the populist candidate, almost won. The Dan, the former mayor of Bucharest, came back in and won it by a fairly small margin. Marine Le Pen, she will be possibly the next French president. What's her stance going to be? That's unclear. Viktor Orban could still be there ahead of 27. So if we think about Europe sort of pulling together, and we think about the counterpoint being populist, I don't think this is not over. What J.D. Vance did in Munich, what he stirred up, is something that sort of could carry on and probably will carry on for some time.
I agree with that, but I would also counter with this. I think one of the unexpected outcomes of Trump has been to revitalise the left. So I think at the start of the year, I wrote a piece saying our left-wing government's becoming one term. You had Schultz out, you had Albanese on the precipice of being out, and you certainly had Trudeau out the door. Now, if they hadn't changed from Trudeau, I think Trudeau would have lost, but they changed to Carney and scraped through. So there is a surge in the left's, I think, raison d'etre. They're finding themselves again, and being anti-Trump is a good look for them. Let's also see, and a lot of this will be determined, let's see if the Trump administration pulls off victories. I mean, right now they're looking a bit frail. I think if they start upending court rulings, my concern, not so much with all these court rulings coming up against tariffs and things like this, with what Trump is doing, is not so much that the courts knock them down. It's what if Trump doesn't obey the courts? Where are we then? And I think that's actually a really dangerous point that we're finding ourselves in, because I think there is very ample opportunity that, for instance, with the deportations, they start deporting American citizens who are criminals or accused criminals. And then what? And so gradually you're seeing these lines desensitized. And I think there is a moment coming where we do see the Trump administration start challenging the courts. And that's very worrying, because institutions are institutions, but they're only institutions for as long as we all believe in them. And I think the minute Trump starts saying we no longer believe in these institutions is a really dangerous moment. So let's see, because I still think there's a strong movement in conservative voices around the world, and this is a moment for the conservatives also. They have to redefine themselves in MAGA's shadow and work out how to do that effectively. We're not seeing a good model for that yet. I think there is a chance. What
that emphasises is that Trumpism there's no real ideology behind it. There's nothing that other conservatives can link to in it.
Well, I think Trump isn't a liberalist, and that's not conservative. So there's ample opportunity for anyone who is not illiberal, who's a Democrat, whether you're left or right or whatever, to find your moment here. And I think the left is showing signs of doing this in a way that they would not have had available to them if it hadn't been for Trump. I honestly do think Trump won Labor in Australia 10 extra seats. I don't think Labor will ever have such a happy force of collision of events in an opposition leader who didn't bother to do any work, and Trump, and all the global anxiety. I mean, that's just a phenomenal swirling storm that came together at the right time for them. It's up to the right now to find that similar momentum and work out what it is and defeat populism. But look, if MAGA goes to hell and you see dangerous scenes in the United States or worrying scenes, then I do think that changes the game for the populist right in Europe too.
Latika, I think that's a very good note to end it on there. It's been a fantastic conversation, wide-ranging as ever, bringing in Australia, China, Canada, Europe, the UK, and your coverage and ability to talk about it all is amazing. So thank you very much. It's been a really, really good conversation, and I hope we'll have you back again soon.